Welcome to the Intifada Globalists, a podcast against international Zionism. I'm Anonsus.
And I'm Doug.
On today's episode, we're really going to focus on probably one of the most important industries within Israel, and also one of the most important ways that Israel gets international support, and that is through the arms trade, right? Israel is itself a major player in developing weapons. Anybody who's played Call of Duty or has even a cursory knowledge of guns is probably aware of, for example, things like the Galil, the Uzi, the Desert Eagle. These are Israeli weapons. However, you've probably heard of the Golden Dome, the Israel's developments in
Iron Dome
armored weapons. But what you probably aren't necessarily as aware of is the fact that Israel is not only a major player in terms of arms export and a country that gets quite a lot of international military aid, especially from the United States, but Israel has also acted as a kind of go-between, right? Israel is a way for, if you're a country and you want to supply military aid to another country that's maybe under a little sanctions, maybe, killing a couple of civilians, doing the stuff that, most of us would agree is bad, Israel is more than willing to act as a middleman. So, I guess to start off, just how much military aid is Israel receiving, right? What are some of the major ways that Israel has gotten assistance in developing its own military capability from abroad?
First of all, simply just investment from New York headed to Israel. There are American tech firms, including older stock ones, but also more recently we've seen Palantir et al. Involved in the Israeli military-industrial complex. There's a way in which Israeli academia, particularly STEM academia, is both integrated with the Israeli arms industry and with American and other countries' STEM educational systems. So yes, there's a pretty extensive economic relation between the Israeli military industry and military industries of their allied states.
Yes, and I think that, for example, you mentioned Palantir. There's been a lot of writing about Palantir's role in assisting the Israeli military during the conflict in Gaza. But really, one of the things that makes the Israeli military, even aside from, we'll say, the political implications, even aside from the obvious reasons that so many of these countries are Zionist, is Israel is a state that is almost constantly at war with someone. And so not only does it essentially offer itself as a laboratory where new armed products can be tested on enemy forces, but also Israel is then able to use its combat experience, and I'm doing air quotes, which you can't see because this is an audio podcast, use its combat experience against, civilians to then say, look, this is battle-tested hardware. That's the common marketing pitch for Israeli weapons, and that's a marketing pitch that you can use if you are giving your weapons to Israel to use. As you can say, they've been proven in battle, right? For the longest time, this situation has changed somewhat after the conflict in Ukraine, but for the longest time, a lot of these Western military systems that had been developed, especially by countries that weren't the United States, hadn't necessarily seen combat operations in any real degree. So if you give your weapons to Israel, now suddenly they go from theoretically being good to, oh, look, as it turns out, they're really effective at flattening houses and shooting unarmed civilians, so surely they'll be really good in a war too, right? But yeah, Israel has a great deal of international partnerships, both with corporations and with individual countries.
Yeah, it's like how Daniel Defense, their kit has a sort of prestige on the U.S. civilian market because some of their doodads are used in M4s, So American AR-15 toy collectors think of that as adding a like being a premium feature. The fact that it's military grade. It's been used by the troops overseas. Something similar works with Israeli goods having been used in combat or in, let's say, military operations other than combat. This creates a sort of prestige of battle hardenedness, as well as just like by like a testing format.
Mm-hmm. Well, and it's interesting too because in particular, right? So Israel has a great deal of countries that it works with in military development. And some of these countries, like for example, India, they'll do joint projects together. But Israel is obviously involved in war a lot more of the time than India is. So Israel really gets to be the, like you said, the sort of testing ground for a lot of these weapons. But um, Israel, despite producing a lot of its own weapons, does import a lot of military arms, especially but not only from the United States. Uh, what perhaps extremely famous Israeli military capabilities are heavily reliant on imports from America and other overseas suppliers.
Yeah. Well, the big one you're talking about, but first of all, like they don't really produce much in the way of aircraft. So F-35s, for example, are obviously all American. But the big one I think you're getting at is good old Iron Dome, the Iron Colander.
Mm-hmm. The Iron Dome, which I may or may not have called the wrong term at the beginning of this.
Yeah, use the
Uh,
Trump term for Trump's idea of interceptor program in the U.S.
did I really call it the Golden Dome?
Yeah.
Well, our listeners are going to
No,
have
no,
to
no, no.
trust that I. Go ahead.
There's some point perhaps to be made there, like some sort of joke about gold, but
Well, it is interesting though, right? Because the Iron Dome is probably, I mean, realistically, it's probably the Uzi just because it was in all the '80s action movies. But the Iron Dome is probably Israel's most famous and vaunted military achievement. Right? They have created an interceptor that can stop any missile attack that targets their country, except for all the times missiles get through. But when those missiles don't get through, my goodness, the Iron Dome. We've all heard people talk about the Iron Dome, right? It's inspiring enough that Donald Trump wants to create the Golden Dome in America. He wants his own equivalent of the Iron Dome because it seems that Trump also believes that the Iron Dome is this impregnable fortress. But the
yeah,
Iron Dome,
what it actually does, like, it's not uh, it's not designed to be like an all-purpose interceptor. It's like specifically for Katyusha type. I guess you'd say like things just above CRAM level threats coming from South Lebanon or from the Gaza Strip. That's what's for. It's basically like counterinsurgency air defense, I guess you'd call it. That's principally what it's for, and why it's so significant to the Gaza war, for example.
yes, yes, it's in other words for listeners who aren't into military stuff at all, like it's designed to shoot down sort of small, lower speed rockets, the kinds that groups like Hamas or Hezbollah have traditionally had a lot of. It's not as effective against, actual missiles that Iran or increasingly other groups that fight Israel have shown that they have the capability to launch. But also, and by the way, that further demonstrates the absurdity of an American Golden Dome, because I don't think there would be a scenario where America is at war and Russia is, maybe who knows, maybe Russia is going to dig out the old World War II surplus stockpiles and they're going to sail a bunch of boats right outside Washington D.C. and launch Katyusha rockets at D.C. I'm not sure. It seems somewhat unlikely that that would be their strategy, but um, the Iron Dome, which is often vaunted as one of Israel's greatest military achievements, is heavily reliant on foreign supply and funding, a something that has caused some controversy in the past.
Many tears have been shed over its funding in
And
Congress,
so,
oddly enough.
yes, yes, in Congress. Um, so what Doug's talking about there is Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez. When was it? When was it that this happened? It was not too long ago.
Yeah, in 2021, we see a series of things leading to conflict. The Sheikh Jarrah um, expulsions of Palestinians in East Jerusalem. We see the classic of Al Aqsa Mosque related violence, Jerusalem Day violence. So, what we see here is basically a Palestinian Islamic Jihad movement and Israel like exchange of fire, which is considerably smaller than the post October 7th war, but which was sort of internationally important in a few ways. So Hamas, of course, also does get involved. There are a few assassination attempts against Hamas leadership. Those were not super successful, and Israel's latest decapitation strike efforts have sort of been like trying to learn from their lack of success in 2021. But this conflict leads to a increase in prestige of the Palestinian Islamic Jihad movement. It probably surpasses PFLP as the second most important resistance faction in the Gaza Strip in 2021 because of this fighting with Israel. But we do, of course, see Israel's strategy of just sort of letting loose big bombs into um, populated areas of the Gaza Strip, terror bombing strategy. 2021 becomes a point at which U.S. aid to Israel becomes more controversial within the U.S. because of this, obviously on a smaller scale than what we've seen since 2023, but we do see terror bombing there. So within U.S. politics, it's sort of like a miniature version of what we've seen since 2023, where you see quite a bit of negative view of Israel emerging among the masses, particularly within, like, I guess you'd say, lower level Democratic Party figures, or just like the broad masses of Democratic Party voters who are really starting to criticize their elected representatives for their support of U.S. aid to Israel. And this leads to a controversy over U.S. funding of the Iron Dome system. Now, the argument is made that, oh, well, this is just a defensive system, it hurt no one, but, like, of course, it's the shield behind which Israel carries out its wars against the Gaza Strip and against southern Lebanon. Uh, it's like you can't
Hmm.
really separate out you can't really separate out offensive and defensive arms that way. Like, the joking response to people trying to do this within, like, Democratic Party politics at the time was, oh, well, if it's just defensive weapons, then yeah, we should give them to Israel and also to Hamas. Yeah.
Well, it's funny, right? Because, yeah, to your point, um, and what makes this kind of interesting is there is a way that, and I don't think that this is something that has worked anymore. You don't really see this in politics now, at least not to the same extent. You see it a little bit in Republican Party politics, but yeah, this idea that well, I don't support Israel's wars of aggression. I don't support the settlements. Don't support them bombing Gaza, but they have to be able to defend themselves. Well, who do you think they're defending, if not their military forces, right? Would they be involved in all these wars if they weren't constantly attacking people in the first place? I'm not so sure, right? The narrative that you can somehow separate, like, little old Israel, poor innocent little old Israel. Yeah, okay, sure. Every single year, seemingly, they're trying to annex new territory or killing civilians. But when you put all that aside, they're just the poor victims being bullied by the powerful, wealthy, international, arms exporter named Gaza is a little ridiculous, right? The idea that this conflict, which has traditionally seen Israel attacking, and there have been exceptions, and there have been a couple of very famous and successful exceptions, offensives started by anti-Israel forces. But generally speaking, Israel is usually the aggressor. And when you attack someone and then they punch you back, and then you say, "Well, now I've got to defend myself," that's a bit of a silly argument now. But on top of that, I guess it's interesting because with the Iron Dome, you see that is probably Israel's most successful effort to depict its military force as being primarily defensive.
Yeah, and it led to. I think we should perhaps go into a bit more detail on the crying in Congress incident to which we were referring.
Yes. So, but for context, at the time, there was a vote going on in Congress to greenlight $1 billion in additional funding for the Iron Dome. $1 billion, a lot of money, $1 billion American dollars funding it. And it was a classic close vote, right? And it ended up going 420 votes of yes to 9 that were no. Classic, really, really nail biter. Nobody was sure if America would actually fund it. But notably, AOC, who is generally lauded as one of America's most progressive politicians. Well, progressives have never been fans of Israel. That has always been kind of in Congress, or at least in my lifetime, the people that you might see. It's usually progressives, and then whatever one or two Republican libertarians slip in there that'll be skeptical of funding Israel. And
Yeah, progressives tend to be
AOC,
skeptical of Israel unless there's some other identity political angle going on there, which there frequently is.
yeah, well, true. I mean, even it's not like it's not like I'm saying that the progressives in the Democrat Party are hardline anti-Zionists or anything of the sort. But what makes that situation interesting is AOC did not vote yes or no. She ends up voting present, which apparently brought her to tears. It seemed at the time, and I remember this, and all the reporting indicates that she might have originally been planning to vote no, and then there was pressure from within the party, and maybe speculation time. Maybe a little bit of a communication that, hey, you can be in the House and you can be a progressive in one of the Democrat safe districts, and you can be sort of tepidly anti-Israel. But if you want to get to the big leagues, you gotta know where the bread is buttered, right? If you want to move up in this party, you can't be openly anti-Zionist. But she put out a very, very confusing statement about why she voted the way that she did. It doesn't quite track to me. For example, she says, "I believe strongly that Congress should take greater scrutiny with all military funding across the world. For far, far too long, the U.S. has handed unconditional aid to the Israeli government." That that would make sense. Okay, yeah, America does seem to kind of unconditionally fund Israeli government. But then she seems to say that the problem is not even that Israel's getting the funding, it's that the vote was too fast. That instead of giving Congress, keep in mind, the same House that voted 420 to 9 to support this, she's like, we should have had more time to debate this. You might wonder, what's the purpose of a debate if there are 42 times as many people on one side as the other before the vote, right? What do you think this debate would actually accomplish, AOC, if anything? Or maybe you're just coming up with an excuse for why you voted for something that or not even voted for, but did not vote against something that your progressive constituency really, really, really would like you to vote against.
Yeah, and this sort of is a early foreshadowing of the trend in, I guess you'd say, post October 7th, 2023 U.S. politics, where the leadership of, especially the Democratic Party, but increasingly also the Republican Party, their pro Zionist positions are massively out of step with the popular sentiment of their bases, which leads to a couple of derangements of political discourse and leads to sort of an increasing use of hard power against the U.S., like the Egyptian model of Zog. It's yeah, you just start seeing a real contradiction emerging where a state which presents itself as democratic has to just aggressively go against the will of um, an increasing majority of the American people, and this is sort of a real crisis point, which we were just seeing the beginnings of back in 2021, but a real crisis point for the liberal democratic project, really. And
Yes,
same thing with the points that we were making in previous episodes about the post-war concept of international law, similarly getting shredded. The concept of academic freedom, a whole lot of different, sort of institutional backups of what is a Zionist and also rather Jewish order, um, just sort of no longer being fit for purpose or running up against the population from whom they derive legitimacy, no longer viewing them as right and increasingly no longer viewing them as legitimate.
yes, yes. And I think that, you know, part of what makes it really fascinating when you're talking about, say, AOC seeming to go against all of her usual political instincts to vote present on a bill that funds Israel is, yeah, like it's a lot like the war with Iran, where you have a president who ostensibly ran on the ticket of no new wars and my opponent will try to start wars, I won't, starting a war. And it's like with very, very little popular support. I mean, aside from essentially American Jews, hardcore evangelicals, and extremely war hawk conservatives, the vast majority of the American public has been opposed to the war with Iran. Well, similarly, although to maybe not as quite a, like you said, it was just the beginning in 2021. Um, American progressives, the kinds of people that back AOC, campaign for AOC, donate to AOC, they do not support Israel. And when you're in a situation in a country
Although
that
specific,
brags
sorry
about,
to interrupt, but specifically in the case of donations, a firm distinction has to be made between the very much pro-Israel large donors and the people just sending in like $15 who are probably going to be anti-Zionist.
yes, yes, that is correct. That it's a lot like, because, and maybe this is getting a little far afield, but of Israeli arms, but I'll try to tie it back. Um, Traditionally, one of the things that progressive candidates in this country have really been able to brag, and as they should, is that they get a higher proportion of donations from everyday Americans, and they tend to get less donations from the big money donors, right? Again, in a way, this sort of mirrors the initial sales pitch of Trump, who, and obviously we both know this is not the case now, but initially, one of Trump's selling points in 2016 was, I don't have a lot of the institutional backing of the other candidates, but I have the people, right? I don't have all of the multi-million dollar donations, but I can make up for that by getting lots and lots and lots of small donations from ordinary people. And when you are sort of running your political platform, or when your campaign is built on this platform, rather, of I do what the people want. The people are on my side. It's not a good look when you go directly against what the people want, or the moneyed minority, right? For the interest groups I mentioned beforehand, American Jews, hardline war hawks, and your more Zionist evangelicals, at the expense of that majority that you claim to represent, right? And when you're in a democracy where everybody's vote is supposed to matter and where the people's voice is supposed to be heard, it's really not a good look when the people's voice is in fact suppressed, shut down, and called anti-Semitic in favor of a much smaller minority. So AOC, tying it back to the Israeli arms issue, the problem that this creates is that when you're dealing with Israel, and we've talked about this a lot in the past, and Doug made some good points about it earlier in this podcast. Israel is not a state that you can separate from its military action. In the same way that it's absurd to separate a state like a defensive actions in a war from offensive actions in a war, especially when those defensive actions are because you attacked the enemy in the first place. It's very difficult to separate Israel's, civilian government from its military action. The two are very, very, very closely linked. We've talked about this a lot. And it's very hard to separate Israel's economy from its military. Israel purchases a lot of weapons from overseas. Israel sells a lot of weapons, right? Israel is a major, major player in the international arms market. And what this has meant is as populations, especially in the West, have become increasingly anti-Zionist or look at Israel's conduct and don't exactly see a very moral country, they don't really think that it's the most moral army in the world, it puts some of the countries that purchase from Israel or supply Israel in a bit of a bind, because they obviously want to keep the gravy train rolling, but they don't want to necessarily draw a lot of attention to the fact that they are funding this government. So what are some of the methods that Israel has used to continue to be a player in international arms while perhaps lowering its profile a little bit?
Oh, sorry, just real quick, I wanted to hit on one last Iron Dome point. So, this argument that's been going on among, I guess you'd say, like the libish masses over the past 5 years over this topic has actually led to J Street, was sort of like liberal APAC,
Mm-hmm.
accepting the position of U.S. Iron Dome funding being ended. So, again, this is sort of a demonstration of the big shift of American politics over the past 5 years, especially since October 7th, that even even an Israeli soft power org like J Street sort of has to accept that AOC is going to vote no now on that instead of voting present.
Yes, and actually, that does sort of link together with where I was going to pull it again, because first of all, recent reporting has shown AOC has now said she won't support funding for the Iron Dome, and to your point, J Street has said it's fine. That is another example of the sort of shift in strategy, right? Before we move into sort of Israel's more shadowy methods of gaining or selling weapons, I think it's notable to say that along with the sort of J Street shift towards accepting that American support for Israel might diminish, at least from progressives, this is all part of a changing strategy. Once you can no longer conduct a lot of this stuff proudly and openly, you move into, or at least the Zionists have decided they will move towards more ambiguity, more some level of dissent being acceptable, sort of admitting that maybe they're going to have to cut their losses with certain groups. This is, I think, something we've talked about a lot Um, if Trump and the current presidential administration represents a very blunt and open form of Zionist to maybe a degree that hasn't been seen before in this country, with just kind of like, if you're a protester that opposes this war, you're going to get doxxed by the doxing van, right? If you're a congressman that is skeptical of Israeli aid, you're an anti-Semite and you're going to be attacked publicly by the president. But there's also an acceptance that maybe moving forward, the strategy is going to have to shift somewhat, right? AIPAC has developed a very bad reputation with the American public. I think, and even defenders of Israel they'll say this. They'll go, everybody talks about AIPAC. They focus too much on AIPAC. Could you name another political action? Like, why is it that AIPAC gets all the attention? And to Doug's point, well, if AIPAC is bad press, AIPAC will keep funding the hardliners. But for more, we'll say, publicly moderate Zionists, well, now you've got J Street gaining some steam, right? Now, okay, listen, maybe we won't give as much money to the Iron Dome, or maybe some of the people that would have voted for the Iron Dome a couple years ago won't vote for it this time, but we're not going to become anti-Zionist. We're not going to oppose Israel, right? It's a kind of containment, and it's done in the name of keeping some level of, I don't know, what would you call it? Not positive press, but keeping something is better than nothing in the eyes of Israel.
Yes. So in the episode where Lewis subbed in for you, we covered the Daniel Biss and Kat Abu Ghazala, I think's her surname, but Kat Abu. But anyway, the primary victory of Daniel Biss there, where in his victory speech he goes, so enough about AIPAC. May tonight be the last night I utter their name. This victory belongs to J Street.
Yeah. Oh man, that's great. That's great. It's like if you're a pro-gun candidate and you're like, enough about Remington. Tonight, this victory belongs to Springfield Armory or whatever, you know? Because I mean, J Street is not. We'll say this: J Street is not an anti-Israel donor by any means. But J Street certainly, unlike AIPAC, doesn't have a name that is synonymous with groups like or not groups, people like, let's say, I don't know, Randy Fine or Ted Cruz.
Oh, yeah. Although interestingly, there is another. So Ted Cruz definitely is the AIPAC bro, but Randy Fine actually, there's another Israeli lobbying group for people like him. His guys are ZOA, good old Mort Klein, Zionist Organization of America. So AIPAC is sort of the, I guess you'd say, more typically neocon one. J Street is for your Hillel libs, and ZOA, that's for the people who want Mashiach now. They don't want to wait.
Well, one of the reasons I mentioned AIPAC in relation to Randy Fine is I was reading about him recently, and Randy Fine is actually a really interesting case study for this, because Randy Fine was so just awful on Twitter, literally, like because of Randy Fine's sort of especially bloodthirsty Zionist rhetoric. There was a brief period where apparently AIPAC publicly stopped listing him on the website as somebody they funded. They ended up, to my knowledge,
literally saying on Twitter how much he loves to see babies die.
Yes. It turns out AIPAC does have its limit, and its limit is when you just, like what Doug just said, when somebody sends you a picture of a dead baby and you respond glibly. But even then, that's only temporary. AIPAC did, to my knowledge, end up backing him again. But even AIPAC was like, hey, let's... It's also funny, maybe this is me reading too into things, but if we're talking about sort of J Street, AIPAC, and then ZOA, it is funny how each name is like more explicit. You know what I mean? Because J Street apparently it means Jewish street, but it's just called J Street, right? Okay, J Street, whatever. Kind of sounds like J Press. It sounds like a like a hip brand or something. Then you move to APAC. That's America Israel, right? That's a little more explicit. And then by the time you get to ZOA, it's just like, yeah, we're Zionists. It's all subtlety is removed from the name. It's one step away from your charity just being called like Jews should be allowed to murder Palestinians, the charity. You know what I mean?
Yeah, that one's that NGO is organized under a slightly different tax system, so it's.
But I guess looping back to arms a bit. Israel doesn't just receive a lot of military aid from the United States and from other countries, although the United States is obviously its biggest backer. And to what Doug said with the F-35, America often is what's providing the most high, I don't know how to say it, high tier, high ticket item weapons, like, aircraft, this sort of stuff. But Israel also manufactures a lot of its own military equipment, especially missiles, to some extent drones, small arms. Israel has a pretty strong military industry, and they export weapons to a lot of countries. A lot of countries. Some of these countries include, the United States, a lot of European countries, India, all the way down to a couple of more, we'll say, controversial examples. South Sudan, the military government of Myanmar, Azerbaijan, but just really quickly, because
UAE
when I
is
found
also a big
this,
one.
yes, the UAE, really quickly, and this is something that happened in the past, but it is so absurd that I figure this could be a good intro into maybe the Israeli approach to selling weapons. Israel funded a little thing. Israel gave small arms and weapons to, a minor thing, you might have heard about it, the Hutu power movement during the Rwandan genocide. Now, Doug, when you think of the Hutu power movement in the Rwandan genocide, what sort of ideology are you seeing on display there?
Well, I'd assume they must be a liberal democratic Hutu power movement there. They must be into peace between neighboring peoples. They must be all about post-war rules-based international whatever.
Yes. They probably will say they love all races. They're very progressive, nonviolent. The Hutu power movement. So the Rwandan genocide, Israel provided bullets, rifles, and grenades to the Hutus during the Rwandan genocide. And this is what blew my mind. And this is reporting from Haaretz. So, I don't think that they would make this up. They mentioned an Israeli arms dealer, a quote from him, who took a tour of Rwanda after this genocide, right? And he had a quote. This is interesting. The arms dealer expressed pride in his actions because his arms helped the victims die quickly. A bullet to the head instead of hacks by a machete. I'm actually a doctor, he said. So, an Israeli arms dealer is supplying weapons to the Hutus during the genocide. Weapons that Israel apparently captured during the war in 1973, the war with many names, and to the Hutus. And, they sort of justify it in the way that you typically would in this kind of scenario. They said, well, if you think about it, it's probably better that we gave the bullets that killed them because otherwise they would have been killed with machetes.
Yeah, it's also kind of funny. Okay, this point display that me and Anonsis are too embedded in right-wing Twitter discourse, but there's the whole idea of Israel being in some way more Western than its enemies, or representing being white somehow. But it's the Hutu power movement, their ideology was so incredibly anti-white that they viewed the Tutsis as like excessively white. And if you've ever met a Tutsi before or seen a picture of one, they don't exactly look like us. But the idea is they're too mixed with North Africans, and anyway, they were pro-Belgian back during colonial days. So, all of us good, proper sub-Saharan Africans should wipe them out on those grounds. Um, Israel is here backing a force which is like so anti-white that they're like murdering other black people for not being black enough.
Yes. Well, and it's the reason that I think that Israel providing arms to the Hutus is such a good example of what we're getting into now. Is Israel is really the country to go to if you are a very, very sketchy group and you need to get guns, right? Israel in that way is remarkably mercenary, right? They will provide guns to the Hutus during the Rwandan genocide. So like literally a genocide is happening and Israel's like, all right, let's keep the bullets flowing. Um they funded, and to Doug's point, right, there is this kind of rhetoric, and we talked about it a bit in previous episodes. There's this attempt to reframe Israel as a kind of bastion of Western identity in the Middle East that is standing against a bunch of savage, superstitious, backwards, violent religious fanatics. One that I mean that's a lot of projection coming from the state of Israel, but also Israel is very, very willing to, if the prophets are right or if it hurts their geopolitical enemies, back all kinds of strange or groups that would and countries that would seem to be opposed to that kind of image. I think another interesting example is, to a lesser extent, Azerbaijan, because there's a lot of rhetoric about the sort of Israel as this Jewish state that is also defending the Christians of the Middle East. This is a very common sort of propaganda angle in the United States about
Yeah,
Israel.
it's an angle you can only believe if you don't know anything about stuff. Like, just like ask any Palestinian Christian. Some of them have been on our show before. To what extent Israel is the defender of Christendom in the Middle East,
Yes, and in fact,
or ask an
when you
Armenian.
have yes, and that's the thing, right? When you talk about like Armenia, I know Armenia is not really the Middle East, right? But Armenia, Azerbaijan, what do you have in that conflict? Where you have a sort of Muslim country against a Christian country, and interestingly, Iran backs the Christian country, Israel backs the Muslim country. This might make this will totally blow your mind if you're somebody that only buys Israeli rhetoric, because this would seem to be the polar opposite, right? Iran is the funder of evil Islamic extremism. Israel is the protector of innocent Christians in Israel and Lebanon and Palestine against evil anti-Christian fanatic Muslim jihadis, right? But no, Israel is actually very, very willing to closely cooperate militarily with countries like Azerbaijan, with the Hutus. Another example would be in with the military government in Myanmar. Now, that's not really a religious conflict, but in that case, you have a country where the Myanmar military government is under a lot of international sanctions. They're not really the kind of country you're supposed to be exporting arms to. Um, they're getting arms, and one of their main suppliers is, of course, Israel. But Israel doesn't just. Another example would be the RSF in South Sudan, who are backed, who get funding in arms from Israel. But Israel doesn't just back the sketchy groups. Israel does also sell weapons to countries that are becoming rising Zionist hotspots. Two prominent examples being Nigeria and India.
Yeah, India in particular is quite famous in discourse of the day for its really hard Zionist pivot. Nigeria is one that hasn't gotten as much attention in American discourse, I don't think, which is kind of odd because they've got a large diaspora in the U.S., and this Zionist tendency is heavily bound up with um, evangelical movements in the U.S. Becoming widespread in Nigeria, and also those same evangelical movements um, making a larger diaspora. You know, evangelicalizing Nigeria and also bringing evangelical Nigerians back to the U.S.
Yes. And we talked about Nigeria a bit in our episode on evangelicalism because in a lot of ways, not always, but especially when you're dealing with Africa and South America, a rise in American style evangelicalism is often coupled with a rise in support for Zionism. But Nigeria is one of several African countries that purchases a great deal of its military arms from Israel. But India is almost a more interesting example because without diving into the weeds too much, India's military is very eclectic. It has India has long been sort of the golden goose that almost every military arms company chases because India is very willing to buy weapons from. Okay, so for context, during the Cold War, traditionally speaking, your average country at some point would make a choice. Do you buy your weapons from the Soviet sphere or the NATO sphere, right? There were a couple countries that were a little looser. For example, let's say you mostly buy from the Soviets, but you want a little bit of Western gear. France might be the supplier, right? Or let's say you mainly buy American stuff, but you maybe want a little bit of Soviet stuff. You could get it from somebody like the Czechs. This was achievable, but generally speaking, right, and this has sort of continued to today. Most countries tend to stick with, broadly speaking, one of these two kinds of spheres, right? Do you get your weapons from the sort of the West, or do you get them from Russia and China? India is the greatest exception to this rule because India has always bought a lot of weapons from Russia. They've also always bought a lot of weapons from France. They've also always bought a lot of weapons from Israel. And they have a number of military development projects that they operate together with Israel as partnerships. This is a very, very common way for Israel to spread its military industry, right? Is they will enter partnerships with various countries. These partnerships aren't just, in India or in Africa. These are in Europe too. I mean, we talked about America. In America, there are a lot of these sorts of dynamics at play. But India in particular buys a lot of weapons from Israel. And its increasing pivot towards Zionism politically, especially the Hindu majority, as India has become less of a sort of secular socialist aligned country and more of a sort of Hindu nationalist conservative country, it has drawn closer and closer to Israel, especially in military matters. Right?
Yeah. Yeah, also back real quick on the sketchy countries thing. So, a lot of countries which, for example, the U.S. isn't going to provide arms to, the ones we just mentioned, like it's not a whole U.S. support for Burma or South Sudan or even really Cameroon. There is more for the UAE, but in general, the U.S. is theoretically not supposed to provide arms for countries which are going to use them for war crimes or for domestic repression. There's the Leahy law from good old Senator Leahy. He's made the point that Israel's always gotten an exception from for this, of course. Like, really, the only time that Israel's received like sanctions under this was like um, a small Israeli unit which murdered a Palestinian American in the West Bank in 2022, and like temporarily Biden suspending the sale of 2,000-pound bombs to Israel in favor of smaller, more precise ones. But no, in general, like other countries which would fall afoul of the Leahy Law, where the U.S. trying to arm them, uh, Israel sort of serves as a conduit. And it's not just from the U.S., it's from other countries which back Israel. Israel sort of serves as the one who will do your exporting for you. So you can spare some of the negative reputational consequences of being like the war crimes armor by just being the Israel defender, and then the weapons you send to Israel for its defense they wind up reselling to various dictatorships.
Yes, yes, and I think that that's notable because yeah, Israel really, in a lot of ways, seems to act as a perfect sort of go-between, right? In some cases, to achieve its own geopolitical ends. In some cases, seemingly purely just for profit, getting a little bit of quick cash from funding various military uh, dictatorships, various supplying weapons to various sketchy genocidal organizations like the Hutu power movement. It's surprisingly, in a way that almost sounds like some kind of bigoted joke. Uh, Surprisingly, a lot of it seems to be just about getting a quick buck, right?
Yeah, that's a bit that we may underrate, considering all this focus on like Israel as like some sort of master planner that's been everything it does is built around a 2,000 year old goal. We can lean into that sometimes, but like Israel selling British arms to China is it's difficult to explain like what geopolitical goal Israel is trying to accomplish there. Um, that's
Yes,
just purely pecuniary.
yes, and I think that yeah, people can very often, I agree with you, kind of sometimes overestimate the extent that some of this stuff is like carefully planned and choreographed. Sometimes, yeah, it really is just China's going to give us money for this, let's say, I don't know, missile technology, and we could use that money. So we'll sell it, and we know that unlike other countries that would that are in kind of the, broadly speaking, at least, American orbit, we might not get in trouble for doing that, right? We can get away with it to a degree that other allies might not. So I guess moving forward on the question of Israeli arms exports, beyond just functioning as a go-between, given Israel a level of power that it might not otherwise have, especially in places like Europe. Because, as we mentioned earlier, Israel is Israel is a country that has a little bit of a controversial reputation, right? Israel is not necessarily the most well loved country in the world. It's a country that theoretically is supposed to be under sanctions sometimes. Certainly doesn't seem to be very often. But one of the ways that Israel is able to kind of get around this to some extent is leveraging their partnerships with various countries that should otherwise put them under sanctions to basically keep these countries from getting them in, from punishing them. And there's a great example from The Economist in an article titled "How Israel's Arms Exports Have Made It Sanction Proof," where they talked about how Israel has a lot of partnerships, not just with India, but with different European militaries. And in these countries, as Israel has become unpopular, there have been pressures to not continue military partnerships with Israel. And we'll move into in a second. This has become more of a news story recently. But there's a great quote here from an Israeli executive who the article says, quote, even Mr. Macron's presidential jet, he adds slyly, uses an Israeli system to protect it from anti-aircraft missiles. Because what ended up happening is at the Paris Air Show, is this arms expo in France, the Israeli, the French government didn't necessarily like the optics of what Israel represented at this show, and so they had the Israelis. They put screens around the Israeli exhibits. They didn't make them leave, but they blocked them off. They kept them out of view. This is something that is becoming more common, right? You have these countries that rely on, in some way, Israel for their military equipment. And as Israel becomes unpopular, these countries go, hey, it's a bad optics hit for us to just be openly like, hey, come down to our military show. You could buy as many Israeli arms as you want. The country that is constantly and flagrantly committing war crimes. But they still want to keep these weapons, right? They still want these weapons around. So they're not going to actually cut off Israel. They're just going to kind of, ferret them away to maybe the back area. So I guess, Doug, the question is, recently in Europe, especially in countries like, I don't know, Spain, for example, there has been a lot of talk, or Croatia. In a lot of European countries, there's been talk about maybe cutting down their relationship with Israel, at least militarily, right?
Yeah, yeah. We even see the threat of U.S. trade sanctions specifically against Spain for their lack of support for the Israeli-led coalition's war against Iran.
Yes, and there you kind of see the way that Israel has been able to leverage its relationship with America to sort of threaten these countries. Because what happens is now it's starting to move from just, oh, okay, you don't support our war, well, that's fine, you're still going to buy weapons from us, to, if you don't support our war, like if you don't explicitly support what we're doing in this conflict, we're going to try to have the United States potentially put sanctions on you, basically as like an enemy nation. And by the way, this is an aside, it's kind of humorous that the outcome of this war very well could be sanctions being dropped on Iran and sanctions being instated on Spain. But yeah, it's interesting because Spain is another country that at one point had a kind of military relationship with Israel that is under fire because it's such a negative public relations hit for the government, right? And Spain is one of the European countries that in 2025 had talked about, I think if I remember correctly, they ended up backing out of a contract with Israel to purchase tens of millions of rounds of ammunition that they had originally agreed to buy. Overall, when you're dealing with Israel, you're dealing with a major player in the international arms industry, right? Now, the international arms industry is broadly speaking, you've got your obvious big players, right? The United States, Russia, China, France, more than you would think. And you've got a couple of countries that are surprisingly prominent, especially South Korea, which has really seen its importance increase. But Israel has remained firm as a big player in that field. And what is notable about Israel, and what in a lot of ways kind of separates Israel from some of these other countries, is not only the fact that Israel gets a great deal of international aid on its own, often at a very great value from America and from other allies, not only that Israel is remarkably morally flexible, with who it will export its arms to, but also that purchasing weapons from Israel in the way that it might not be with, for example, France, less so with America and Russia, who are both involved in military conflicts as we speak. But if you're a country and you are purchasing military arms from Israel, you are essentially, in some way, you are directly funding a militarily aggressive and violent state, right? Every cent that you spend on Israeli arms is going to go back towards, putting it bluntly, killing Palestinians, killing people in Lebanon, in Iran, etc. Right? Investment in Israel has purchasing weapons from Israel is essentially directly funding one of the most, if not probably the most, militarily aggressive states in the world that commits a truly astounding amount of war crimes, flagrantly, as we've talked about in many previous episodes. In addition, when you are instead entering strategic partnerships with Israel, military development partnerships with Israel, you are giving the Israeli state leverage over your country. You are giving Israel a pressure point that it can apply when your population starts to oppose it, right? When your population starts saying, hey, we're not so sure that Israel's necessarily that great a country to be associated with, Israel can say, well, you want to keep your military functional, right? You rely on us for your missile systems, or you rely on us for your small arms, right? You don't want that relationship to go away, do you? So Israel's arms industry and Israel's connections with the international arms industry are a major part of its importance or a major factor that keeps it important in the world and keeps it relevant and allows it to continue to exercise some level of influence and control over various countries, right?
Yeah, it's a form of Israeli soft power abroad, and of course, its arms industry provides hard power abroad.
Yes. I think that's the ticket, right? As we talked about when we got into the discussion of different, the ZOA, the APAC, the J Street topic. Anytime you're dealing with Israel or with Zionism and its various international backers and networks, you're dealing with a mixture of hard power and soft power, right? You're not just looking at a state that exercises you're not just dealing with a state that is militarily, attacking its rivals, killing civilians on its border, engaging in this various war crimes, but you're also dealing with a state that is able to effectively leverage its business connections, its its less violent means. And with the Israeli arms industry, you really, in a lot of ways, have a fusion of the two, because you have this military industry that is also deeply connected not just to the Israeli economy, but also to the defense of various countries around the world. So I guess as a sort of final thought moving forward, what, and this is time for us, the two of us, to engage in a bit of reckless speculation. What would seem to be the potential future for the infamous Israeli arms industry, right? Will it continue to have a place of importance going forward, or do you think we're going to see more and more countries start to decouple themselves, like certain European countries like Spain have?
Well, I think European countries are more likely to, with perhaps the exception of the German Federal Republic. That's the one would not. Uh, However, in the third world, yeah, I'd predict an increase of Israeli influence. the India, Nigeria, the Kenya example, even in Southeast Asia, and now in the, I guess you'd say, anti-Sao Paulo Forum coalition being formed in Latin America. Yeah, I just increasingly see just an Israeli pivot to the third world.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and I think that's a good thing for us to kind of wrap up on is Israel, and you mentioned Southeast Asia, right? We mentioned Myanmar. One country that we didn't mention that has a massive amount of military cooperation with Israel is Vietnam.
Yeah,
Vietnam.
and yeah, Vietnam in particular is also a country that's involved in Trump's Board of Peace efforts, and there's a point that in my Twitter bio I promised not to argue about, which I could make about India, Vietnam, Israel alignment, but
Well, but it is funny. I think I really do think it is interesting that yeah, Israel, as it takes more flack in the West, as it starts to become more unpopular in America, in Europe, it is pivoting not just in countries where evangelicalism is increasing, where there has been a corresponding increase in Zionism, but really just in the third world in general. It seems Israel has really found a new potential home for its military arms industry. That maybe moving forward, Israel might not be able to sell as many arms to places like Spain or France or first world countries, but as long as they can continue to be a dominant military supplier for places like Vietnam, places like Argentina, places like Nigeria, their arms industry is going to continue to be a big deal. And as we mentioned earlier, one of Israel's continuous sort of selling points for its military industry has been the fact that it is quote unquote battle tested, right? So whenever these countries buy weapons from Israel, part of the sales pitch is these are weapons that have been used in combat, right? These are weapons that work. Well, what is that combat, right? What if you are a country that is buying weapons from Israel? What really is the selling point that you're buying? The selling point that you're getting is, hey man, our weapons are great. You know how you know? Just look at Gaza. Look at Lebanon, right? The sales pitch in a very dark way. One of the things that makes the Israeli arms industry profitable is the fact that Israel is constantly engaged in wars of aggression. Because the more people that Israel kills, the more it is able to market its weapons as being successful and worth the dollar. Right? It's almost an economy. It is almost a profit rather that is fueled explicitly by slaughter. And that is, I think, well, I don't know. I'm struggling to think of how to word this because it's a very bizarre thing to think about, but it's not good. It's a very uncomfortable feeling when you realize that the wars that Israel engages in are not just for the sake of expanding its own borders and for the sake of its own geopolitical vision, but are also in a way an advertising campaign for one of its most lucrative industries.